welcome to the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. It's a pleasure today to talk to Mr. Chris Whatley, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the United States. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Whatley. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And before we start our little discussion about the United Nations Association, and the preparation for SDGs for the General Assembly meeting, let me just introduce you to our audiences for a second. So Mr. Chris Whatley has a very impressive and diverse background as an expert on international policy issues both abroad and on Capitol Hill. Before joining UNA USA, Chris served as Washington Office Director and Deputy Executive Director of the Council of State Governments, CSG, representing elected officials in all 50 states and the 6 territories on Capitol Hill, forging ties between American states and their counterparts in Canada and Mexico, and serving as an appointed advisor to the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Prior to joining CSG, Chris served as a program officer and field representative for the International Republican Institute, leading a wide range of international election observation missions and technical assistance programs in Liberia, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. He began his career as a research assistant for the United States Institute of Peace, USIP, studying the demobilization and reintegration of former combatants in Zimbabwe following the Lancaster House Agreement. Today, Chris leads UNA USA's national staff in Washington, D.C. and New York, and heads up the association's efforts to increase membership, advocate on behalf of the UN and UN causes, and educate the next generation of UN supporters in the US through UNA USA Global Classrooms Model UN program. So my first question to you, Chris, would be, we are both located here in Washington. The Global Foundation for Democracy and Development has offices here.
Yes.
UNA USA has offices here. We know this town a little bit, but I would dare to say you know it a little bit more than we do, because you have an extensive experience on Capitol Hill and you have been advocating for UN issues for a while. But you also work in New York, so how is it? What is the difference between working for UN issues in Washington and New York?
Certainly. Well, you know, there are some parallels in the sense that the UN is a member state organization. And in fact, there are lots of different UNs. We think of the UN in the embodiment of the Secretary General and what happens in that big, beautiful building on the East River, the Secretariat and its staff. But then you've got the 193 member states and their missions and their role in the policy process of the UN. And they ultimately have the dispositive role in the policy direction of the UN. And meanwhile, you have all those separate UN specialized agencies and programs, that some of them around New York and some of them around the world. Well, within all of that, really the most important actors in the UN system are the member states. And the Secretary General emphasizes that over and over again, that fundamentally often the public might be disappointed in something that the UN does, or feel that the UN should be more impactful in a particular issue. And you'll hear the Secretary General or his spokesperson saying, well, that's up to the member states. Well, we are here in the capital of the United States, one of the UN member states. And if you are an advocate for a strong United Nations system, if you want to see the UN playing a role in advancing the core pillars of its activity in peace and security and human rights and development, then you need those member states to be playing a strong, constructive role in New York. And that means ensuring that the foreign policy audiences that govern the direction of our national security strategy and the importance of multilateral institutions in it, that they know that the UN is important to Americans. So for us, if we are advocates for a strong UN system, it means that we need to be in New York and we need to be monitoring what's going on in the UN system itself, but we also need to be at the table here in Washington, making the case for the importance of the United Nations to the United States. And that's why I hang my hat here. Right. It's why so much of our activity as an association, the majority of our activity, is about mobilizing Americans outside of New York, outside of Washington, to show why the UN matters to them in Los Angeles or in Houston, Texas, or in Minneapolis, those kind of things.
So on one hand, you're mobilizing the forces, even I would say the general public and grassroots organizations and education system. On the other hand, as you're saying, you're motivating the policymakers and the stakeholders in the government.
Yes.
So could you tell me a little bit more about your work about policymakers and in the Congress? How can you motivate and have them get more involved and support the United Nations and its role?
Exactly. Well, I think one of the ways we do that is by talking about what the UN does as well as what the UN is. I think in the United States, to the extent that the general public or our Congress focuses on the UN, it tends to be on the UN as a talk shop, which I think talk's important, so I'm not trying to...
That's the bad image
exactly,
of the UN.
Exactly. So I don't want to minimize the importance of talk, but to the extent that we think about the United Nations in a general sense in the United States, it's often what goes on in General Assembly Week. So that may mean a dictator from some end of the country, some end of the world, espousing on U.S. foreign policy in a way that that is either offensive to certain policymakers in the United States or viewed as irrelevant to certain key events in the world. And as a result, I think that there's this sense that the UN isn't doing enough, or it's doing things that maybe we don't agree with. Meanwhile, what's going on in the frontline work of the UN, eradicating polio around the world.
Right.
You know, there are 5 million kids who are walking today who, if it hadn't been for the efforts of the WHO over the last 20 years, would have suffered polio and been in a completely different life.
So one of your jobs, you would say, is also bringing this good news about the United Nations.
Yes, very much so.
To media and to populations and to policymakers.
And to policymakers, yeah. That really telling the story of what the UN is doing, delivering on the front lines. You know, telling the story that right now in the Central African Republic, there are close to 60,000 people at the airport in Bangui who are really at risk of genocide, who, were it not for the peacekeeping presence that's there, and the UN peacekeepers who are supposed to arrive to reinforce that African Union force in the middle of September, their lives are in direct jeopardy. But the UN has become the kind of actor who can respond to that threat, an actor that's learned the lessons of Srebrenica, of Rwanda, experiences that were searing in my young life, going back 20 years or so. And that really does respond to protecting millions of civilians in the worst, most unstable corners of the world. And when we tell that story about what the UN does on the front line, I think it first of all connects to our values, that we as Americans fundamentally want to see the basic needs of those populations addressed. They want to have somebody, have an ultimate provider of security out there to do it. We aren't prepared to do that ourselves as a nation. But at the same time, we know that that connects to our national interests, in that the experience of the United States ever since September 11 has been to recognize that the deepest threats to our security emerge from the most unstable parts of the world. And it's in those unstable parts of the world where so much of the UN's work is being done, where basic security is being provided, where an al-Qaeda offshoot that had taken over the government in Mali was pushed out through a UN peacekeeping presence. Okay. Those are things that connect to our interests. And when that story is told, I think our own policymakers have the ability to see the UN in a different light.
That you mentioned now peacekeeping forces. Mm-hmm. Actually, according to our research, about 27% of all the budget for the peacekeeping forces comes from the US.
Yes.
And about 22% of the overall UN budget comes from the US.
That's
Still,
correct.
the perception is
yes.
that the Congress is not engaged and is not supportive of the United Nations. And the perception is that the United States is not enough involved. How do you explain that? Is that a perception, a media or is it something that's missing in the action?
Well, I think that there is more than perception there. Certainly, although the UN in public perception is very well received, that you have over 70% of Americans believe that the UN is important to our national interest. But at the same time, there's a case history over many decades of often high debts of the U.S. to the UN, arrears, where we don't pay our dues. The story over the last few years has been good, but we are in jeopardy right now as we speak of going into arrears to the UN again, because the Mali peacekeeping mission and the Central African peacekeeping mission, they haven't been funded yet. So definitely, the U.S. Congress from time to time has withheld its funding support, even those are treaty obligation dues. Those aren't just us giving money to the UN out of the goodness of our heart. We signed on to the treaties that created the UN, that created the dues structure, and at times we do withhold our funding, and that causes a sense of the U.S. Congress not being fully supportive of the UN. I think ultimately it's up to advocates like myself and like all of the Americans who are part of our membership of 20,000 or so Americans around the country to show why those members of Congress should care. I have faith in our Congress. I think that despite the fact that there's often public disappointment in Congress itself, the approval rating of Congress is much lower than the approval rating of the UN.
Than ever.
Exactly. But these are politicians who are serving a constituency. And I come into...
So the constituency needs to
Yes,
improve as well. And this
exactly.
is the other part of your work, working with the grassroots organization and the general public.
Exactly. I think that we get the Congress that we elect, so that if we are Americans who believe that the UN is in our interest, it's up to us to express that to our members of Congress.
Through our votes and...
Exactly, and by making it clear that these are issues that matter to us. And it's a nonpartisan issue. I think that you can make a very strong, fiscally conservative argument for the value of the UN to U.S. national security. It's far cheaper for us to support that Mali peacekeeping mission that's pushed out al-Qaeda than to have a U.S. military engagement in North Africa. Yet it meets our direct national interest. So there is a definite message that would appeal to one end of the political spectrum, but at the same time, the kind of basic work that the UN does in advancing human rights have a certain resonance on the other side of the aisle. But it's up to us to make that case, to connect to more Americans who care about the UN, and to connect those Americans to their political leadership, so that we as a nation stay connected to the UN itself.
I understand right now you have a petition that's been signed by several non-governmental institutions that are part of your Council of Organizations as we are. And could you tell us a little bit about it? What petition is being presented now to the Congress in reference to the climate summit that's going to take place in September? And what are your hopes in reference to it?
Yeah, certainly. First of all, I want to thank your foundation for being a member of our Council of Organizations. This is an element of our...
You're welcome. It's an honor.
Oh, well, thank you. It's an element of our association that's really important, that dates back to the founding of the UN, that brings together like-minded NGOs committed to the UN and its effectiveness. So the petition that was circulated to us and that we signed on to as UNA is calling for a strong U.S. commitment to climate change action at the summit itself. Now, what I would say is our biggest priority as UNA USA is to ensure that President Obama is present. You know, one of the...
this is the first prerequisite.
Yes, exactly.
To be present at the state level, at the high state level.
Yes, it is a big priority of the Secretary General for this to be a head of states conference around climate change. I think that there are good indications that the U.S. will be present in a very important way. I hope that is with President Obama at the table. But there have been a number of commitments made by the administration in recent months using its executive order authority and regulatory authority through the EPA to make what I would view as significant climate change commitments. but certainly for our members. They acknowledge the threat that climate change poses to the globe. They acknowledge that it is a man-driven, man-made environmental challenge, and are looking for the UN to play a significant role, and looking for the US to play a role in making strong commitments within the UN system.
Is UNA-USA working very proactively in the formulation of SDGs, and what is your position and what is your participation in the process?
Well, thank you for asking that. I think that the formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the goals that will replace the Millennium Development Goals, which expire in 2015, is the most important and impactful global policy decision that's going on right now. And your foundation and other NGOs are very much focused on it. I think it needs to be an effort that the world focuses on more broadly. But for us as UNA-USA, we've done a couple of things. First of all, UNDP, the UN Development Program, put out a call to action to all UN member states to conduct a grassroots consultation process, to get outside of their capitals and outside of the think tanks and policy elites, to find out what the general population viewed as their priorities for a new set of development goals, an ambitious agenda to address poverty and climate change and other challenges. So we did that. End of last year, we conducted a series of 12 events in places like Iowa and Colorado and North Carolina, far beyond Washington or New York, to seek American input into what they think the new agenda should be, but also more importantly, because the debate that's going on in the UN, and it's really at a very critical point right now, is focused on this being a universal set of goals. So not just about developing nations and setting priorities that developing nations will meet, and then priorities for the richer developed countries to perhaps fund, but to set a set of goals for dealing with inequality in all nations. So that means it has
implications. Which is very much present in developed countries. We can see it on an everyday basis.
Without doubt, in every developed country, including our own. So we've been focused on having those universal discussions about what a universal agenda might mean for the average community in the United States. What does a universal agenda around access to justice mean for criminal justice reform in our own communities, which are active, live debates that we have all the time. But if we're going to set aspirational goals for the world, viewing our own actions through the lens of those goals, knowing that these are not binding commitments. The UN isn't going to come into a US community or a community in any other country and tell policymakers what they should or shouldn't do, but we're setting a set of aspirations for the world we want, and comparing ourselves to those.
And you're getting also the population in developed countries feel like they are real stakeholders and owners of the goals that belong not only to the developing countries. So it's a shared perspective.
I think that's a very
It's not only this old idea of developed countries paying and developing countries developing on the basis of what they've received as funds.
No, I think that that's a really good point. And even when it comes to some of those goals that in the MDGs that we've had a lot of progress, but there's more work to do, goals around hunger. We have hunger challenges in our own communities. Hunger challenges that are acknowledged by both political parties in the United States. Everybody wants to deal with food security in our own communities as well as around the world.
Homelessness that's growing.
Exactly. And there are different policy pathways you can take to meet this challenge, and maybe those pathways look different depending on which political party you're part of. But acknowledging that there's a challenge there, acknowledging that we have a global aspiration to have populations that aren't hungry, that aren't in the midst of extreme hunger, I think that's a human ambition. And it's, as you say, I think it brings us all together to have that as a shared ambition.
To own the goals and own the actions.
Well said.
And let me ask you, to conclude, I think we are celebrating 70 years of United Nations Association of the US, and soon 70 years of the United Nations.
Yes.
So what would you say? Are there reasons to celebrate?
I think so. Now, we're meeting today at a time in which the world is in a very tough place. There are lots of challenges going on in the headlines right now that would make someone unhopeful about where the world is. But if I think about the United Nations, if I think about its importance to Americans, I have two young daughters, 6 and 11. I know for a fact that the UN will be more important for U.S. national interests, U.S. security, and our values when they are my age, when they are in their 40s, than it is today. So I think for those of us who are committed to the United Nations, who are committed for owning these kind of shared goals that we just talked about, that staying engaged in the UN system and knowing what it means, knowing what the UN does on the front line, eradicating polio, dealing with food security, advancing human rights.
Very tangible goals.
These tangible things, knowing about that and knowing how you can connect to the policy processes that go on in New York, and knowing how to ensure that we stay as Americans at the table by making it a priority for our own policymakers here in Washington, that is going to be even more important going forward. So if you're someone who believes that today, you have a very young perspective because you're on the front end of something. That the UN may be a 70-year-old organization, but it is only growing in relevance in terms of what it is and what it does.
Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we had talked to Chris Whatley, the Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the United States.